Okay, thank you all for joining us this evening. So I'm a solicitor at Agri Advisor, and my job tonight, I think, is to repeat really a presentation I did a couple of weeks back in Welsh on EU exit and its implications. And what in a little space of time, I think it's only 3 weeks maybe ago we did this last time, but things have moved on a little bit since then. So as I go through, I'll try and highlight some of the changes that have happened since as well, where I can. So what we're going to cover in the next hour or so are the legal and policy frameworks in terms of how agricultural policy will work in Wales on exit from the EU at the end of this year. Compiling your farm's risk assessment as well in terms of EU exit and the things perhaps to think about when considering what risks there are and the things that you should be thinking about over coming months, and also as we go into the next stage of the process as well, and then perhaps how to manage those risks and to create opportunities in the current circumstances. So where are we in terms of what's happening at the moment on the UK-EU exit? We've got the Withdrawal Agreement Act that was passed earlier this year, and that has provided for all of the legislation that we have at European level to be transposed into our legislation, and we are in what's called a transition period from that from the beginning of this year to the end of this year, when we will actually exit the EU completely. And it's difficult because we use these terms, transition period, etc., and there is discussion as well of that term when we talk about the move from our current agricultural policy or domestic agricultural policy to the new agricultural policy that we will have as well in terms of transition period, in terms of the new scheme. So when I'm talking about transition period here, I'm talking about the transition period within at the moment in terms of going from being in the EU to being outside of the EU by the end of this year. And in terms of what's happening at the end of this year, when I did this talk last time, we were waiting to see whether or not there was going to be an extension to that transition period, because they had until the 30th of June to agree that there's provision for that agreement to take place. That agreement didn't take place, so it looks as if we are definitely exiting fully and formally at the end of this year. The question, of course, again, is there going to be a deal in terms of how that works, or will we be going into a WTO position at the end in terms of trade rules, for example? So during this transition period, the majority of EU law continues to apply, and if there is a new piece of EU law being passed through the European legislative process, that's subject to scrutiny by the select committees and then debate. But essentially, we are still bound by European law, and we will be bound by European law going forward in terms of the European law that we have at the moment transposing over. So at the end of the year, this year, there are 3 potential options, although I think one of those options is now a definite no. So the first one is a UK-EU free trade agreement, so an agreement between the UK and the EU as to how trade will work between them. And by free trade agreement, we're talking about something very similar to the agreement that we have in place at the moment in terms of trading position going forward. So that would mean there would be no tariffs, etc., in terms of trade between the UK and the EU if we had that kind of free trade agreement in place. A no-deal scenario would mean that we would be subject to the World Trade Organization rules in relation to trade, which means that we would have tariffs in relation to imports and exports of various goods. And you may have seen or heard about the different tariff schedules that there are in relation to different, in terms of different meat, but also in terms of the different cuts of meat as well, etc. So it's very detailed provisions terms of relation to how the tariffs can apply to different things. And the third option I had last time I did this talk was that we may well have an extension. As I said, I think that is probably very unlikely unless there was some kind of agreement across the EU for a period of extra time. And you know, the only reason perhaps that may be still something that could happen, I think, is because of you know, the current circumstances we have in terms of coronavirus and the implications that that has had, obviously, in terms of some of the trade negotiations that have had or needed to have taken place over the last 6 months. And you know, we may still see something extraordinary happen in relation to that. I think the one thing with the whole kind of Brexit process we've learned is that you never know what's going to happen next. So perhaps we shouldn't be ruling it out completely, but certainly in terms of what the legislation provides for and the rules provide for, the time period for that request for an extension has passed. So the last set of negotiations in relation to the UK-EU free trade agreement, which is something I think as farmers we're hoping that will be in place at the end of this year. The negotiations in June ended with what was regarded as being little or no significant progress being made. And those renegotiations and negotiations have started again in this month in terms of looking at you know, those provisions. And you know, just to exemplify what that looks like, I mean, there are 11 areas which are being considered in terms of those negotiating groups, they call them, and that's everything from trading goods to fisheries, to energy, to law enforcement, horizontal arrangements and governance. You know, there's 11 different kind of negotiating groups. So agriculture is only one small part in relation to those negotiations. For there to be a free trade agreement in place by the end of the year, and I put there the 21st of December because obviously, you know, although it's technically the end of the year because of holiday period, etc., it means we really need to have it ratified before that holiday break. For us to be able to do that, there has to be an agreement in place really before the end of October. So when you look at that kind of timetable as well, it means that really they only got effectively about 4 months, 3 to 4 months of real discussion or negotiations that can take place before they have to be in a situation where an agreement can be reached. And although, you know, they're saying no significant progress being made, you know, there are certain things that I think that they are able to agree on, isn't it? But you know, things like even down to, you know, the details about when this new agreement would be reviewed. I mean, for example, the European contingent is saying that they want that to be reviewed every after the first 2 years, then every 4. The UK saying they want it after 10. So you know, there's differences in those kinds of practical elements as well in terms of how that free trade agreement would operate and work in practice in terms of its review, etc. as well. So I think, you know, there is still a lot of work to be done in relation to that, but that is obviously what they're aiming towards putting in place, you know, before the end of the year. In terms of our kind of UK legislation in terms of agriculture going forward, you will have heard about the Agriculture Act, and of course this is moving through the Houses of Parliament at the moment. It's got to the House of Lords, and there are amendments that have been tabled for that as it goes through both the House of Commons, and we've heard of those debates, etc. And now it's going through the House of Lords. I think the hope is that that gets agreed before the summer break, isn't it? But that only gives them a couple of weeks left to get that agreed. I think, you know, having that agreed and in place would be beneficial in terms of knowing what the position is going forward. And that piece of legislation is really the framework piece of legislation for the position in relation to agricultural law going forward within the UK. But in reality, its territorial extent is really limited to a large extent to England, and provisions in relation to England, although some of the kind of framework provisions extend and apply across the UK. It will also apply to Wales at the request of the Welsh Government ministers, and we're yet to see how that agricultural policy is going to develop in Wales. And we'll talk a bit about that in a second, but essentially we will have the equivalent of the Agriculture Act that we're seeing going through Houses of Parliament at the moment for Wales in 2021. That is the idea, is that we would have an equivalent act ourselves here in Wales. But as I said, that is the framework legislation, very much so. It provides the headlines, it provides the general provisions in relation to the rules and regulations that will govern agriculture going forward. The detail is all going to be in the statutory instruments, and perhaps some further acts as well that will kind of go hand in hand with that Agriculture Act. So, for example, there is a statutory instrument as well which has been drafted and is in circulation at the moment in relation to the detail as to how direct payments will work, etc. So there's a lot of minutiae that will be contained in further regulations as well. So in terms of how things will work in Wales, we had a consultation, Brexit and Our Land, which was held in 2018, if you remember, and in July 2019, on the back of the responses they had from that first consultation, Welsh Government revised what they had been thinking about previously, and developed this proposal of a sustainable farming scheme, which would be wider than the current scope of the basic payment scheme that we have at the moment, that would also encompass providing support for improvement, support for advice, etc., and would be something a bit more all-encompassing in terms of the approach it was going to be taking. It was very much embedded in the principle of sustainability, and as we know, Welsh Government is bound by the provisions of the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, that says that they have to implement legislation which adheres to and is consistent with that principle of sustainability. And of course, we already have an Environment Act in Wales in 2016, which is actually much more advanced than the position in terms of environmental legislation that we have in England. And England at the moment are going through the process of developing a similar Environment Act to the one we'd already put in place in 2016. And we've also, as part of that sustainable farming scheme, it talks about sustainable land management, so an outcome-focused approach in terms of how land is to be managed going forward. So those revised proposals then formed part of the next consultation that we've undertaken with Welsh Government, which obviously is sustainable farming and our land. Now, that consultation happened last year, and the responses to that consultation were published in May this year. And since I did this presentation last time, we've also had the Minister's response to that consultation. And basically that has said that they're going to do a further consultation this summer in relation to some of the detail of the delivery of the new scheme that's going to be implemented, to further consult on some of those aspects. That is in addition to the co-design process that was already announced as part of the last consultation, which is work on which has already started. So when we had this presentation last time, the survey that has been commissioned as part of that co-design process was due to close on the 30th of June, and those responses were due by the 30th of June. And I don't know yet how many responses were had in the in terms of final figures, but that was very much an online multiple choice type survey, wasn't it? That people could provide views in response to the questions that were posed. As part of that survey, then people are asked whether they were happy to be contacted further, and my understanding now that there will be further meetings, one-to-one sessions, group sessions with people to take further evidence really, and data and information about people's views about the implementation of the new scheme. So this idea of eco-design is about trying to work alongside stakeholders within the industries, and to make sure that the scheme is fit for purpose by the time it's implemented. So it's to talk more about what the focus of the agriculture policy in Wales going forward is about. The new sustainable farming scheme is designed to try and promote collaborative approaches by farmers. So not just perhaps a farm-based approach, but looking at the ability to look wider than just the individual farm in terms of collaboration projects going forward. The entry to the scheme is going to be subject to a farm sustainability plan and a farm sustainability review, and lots of the questions in the co-design survey was asking questions about what farmers would like to see as part of that review, and what farmers would be willing to do as part of that review and plan. But that will look at all kinds of aspects of your business. Bear in mind that sustainability and sustainable development is not just about the environment, it is also about the economic side of things and also the social side of things in terms of how that farm operates. The support then would be provided in terms of financial support would be provided through a farming payment, sustainable farming payment, and also then there would be provision in addition in relation to business support, and that could include advice from experts in different fields, capital investment, and money for development of technology, etc. And there would also be a revised regulatory framework. It's been promised to be, more simple, I suppose, isn't it? More streamlined in terms of how that framework would be put together. But essentially, there will be minimum standards that you must adhere to as part of your signing up for the sustainable farming scheme. And it talks about smarter monitoring. It talks about perhaps the ability to use technology as well in terms of monitoring the outcomes that are part of the scheme going forward. And importantly, is I think as well proportionality in terms of enforcement, isn't it? So to look perhaps more about the wider objectives and outcomes of the scheme as well in terms of how it's implemented and enforced. So lots of different aspects that will come into the new scheme. Of course, we don't know what the detailed aspects of the scheme will be yet, and that's something that will I'm sure be refined and changed and improved upon further to discussions as part of the co-design procedure that's been instigated, but also as part of the further consultation that will be held this summer. In terms of timeline in relation to that as well, the other thing that the Minister announced last week is that there would be detailed modelling carried out, and that's in terms of economic modelling, in terms of the impact of the introduction of the new scheme on different sectors and also different business types, etc. And of course that's really important because it's not until that modelling is done that we have perhaps an indication as to what that sustainable farm payment in terms of financial terms might look like as well, and what the impact might be on you directly in terms of your business in that regard. So in terms terms of when we were hoping for more detailed provisions before the end of this year in terms of what that might look like, but bearing in mind the announcement last week in terms of the modelling side of it wouldn't be ready until next summer, I think it's probably likely that there are perhaps more detailed provisions in relation to this new scheme and our Agriculture Act in Wales won't be in place as soon as perhaps we thought it might be. And bearing in mind as well, we also have Welsh Government elections next year as well, which clearly will have an impact on the timeline in terms of the process as well. So I think it brings us on to the question of how do we assess the current risk that we are having to manage in terms of the impact that EU exit might have on our businesses, but also on us personally as well, isn't it? And I think it's quite important that we do question ourselves as to what the implications might be, because I think it's quite easy, isn't it, to say, well, at the moment we don't know this and we don't know that, isn't it? In which case we can't assess risk, but that in itself is a risk that can be part of your assessment, isn't the uncertainty of various things and the risk assessment or modelling yourselves as to what if this happened and what if that happened. And how we manage those risks then in order to try and reduce any adverse impact if we can, and perhaps are there opportunities, are there things that would allow us to create an opportunity out of this transitionary period that we're looking at. And one of the things that when you're looking at businesses is you've got this risk model, and you've got a grid there which has got a likelihood of the risk going across the bottom, and then the impact of the risk there on the vertical axis. So, for example, you might look at how likely it is that we are going to have a new scheme in Wales for the instead of BPS, isn't it? Well, that's highly likely, isn't it? So that would probably be a 6. What would be the impact of that on your business? Is it going to be low or high? Well, I suppose that depends on how important the current level of income that you're getting from that scheme is for your business viability. So some of you may say that that's low for your business, but some of you might have that as a high impact, high likelihood event, and you would be populating your box 6 on the axis there, isn't it? So I think with every kind of risk, you have to assess how likely it is to happen, and then also what kind of impact would it have, because if you've got something that's unlikely to happen and it's low risk, then they're not the things that you're going to be concentrating on in terms of your risk assessment. But if you've got stuff in your 6 box there, isn't it, in the furthest corner, then that obviously is something that we should be spending a lot of time looking at and considering in terms of your business and risk assessment going forward. So, having talked about that in terms of how businesses assess risk, the next question is, where do we assess that risk, isn't it? And what aspects of our business might require an assessment and consideration? So the first one there is business viability. I know there's been other webinars that have talked about business viability as well over the last couple of weeks, which have been really useful as well, isn't it? But I think one of the first things which I just mentioned there is, how reliant on that basic payment scheme income or that Glasgow income are you as a business? What does your viability look like? What does your profit level look like if that income was taken out, isn't it? And how much of that income would you have to have replaced under a new sustainable farming scheme for that not to be an issue for you, isn't it? So perhaps sitting down and having a look at some of those figures and what that means for you in terms of your business. And it's not just looking at income from basic payment and Glaston, it's also about looking at the viability of the other businesses that you're running as well, isn't it? So, and by businesses, I'm perhaps thinking more in terms of the different types of ventures that you might have within the business, for example. So your sheep enterprise, for example, how, if you looked at that in isolation, how viable is it? How profitable is it? What are the things that you could be doing in order to improve the viability of that particular enterprise in isolation, isn't it? The difficulty with that, of course, with farming enterprises, we tend to have lots of things going on, and we tend to have lots of different enterprises which complement each other and work together very well as well. And that's obviously part of the overall picture in terms of business viability. But I think it is important as well to divide that out into looking at each of the different sectors and each of the different enterprises that you have, and considering the viability of each of those individually. And of course there's assistance through Farming Connect as well to assist with business planning, etc. So you can look at that with a consultant as well, isn't it, to have advice on that if you need it. So business structure is the next one I've got there. I think we tend to we tend to fall into our business structure very often in terms of farming enterprises. We tend to follow the business structure that perhaps the generation before has followed, or we tend to follow a business structure that we think the majority have got. So in farming terms, we tend to be either sole practitioners or sole traders, isn't it? Or we are partnerships, and by partnerships I mean the traditional partnerships as opposed to limited liability partnerships. But I think we need to be questioning ourselves as to whether or not those are the most appropriate business structures for us. And this is obviously a question perhaps to ask the accountant or to ask your business consultant as well, isn't it? Say, well, look, if you could redesign my business structure, how would you redesign it, and what would make it more appropriate, bearing in mind the type of business that we have. And very often we don't perhaps look at whether or not we have adapted that business structure or changed that business structure as the business has grown, and perhaps now it's not fit for purpose, whereas when it was started it was, isn't it? And one of the classic examples of that might be somebody who's still trading as a partnership but who should be looking at a limited company because of the levels of income tax that they're paying, or because of the liability that they may have within their business ventures. So I think it's really important to consider whether the business structure you've got is still appropriate for your particular business, that it's fit for purpose, and that it's flexible in terms of its ability to change over time and to grow with your business as well. And crucially, that it's absolutely clear in terms of its terms. So do you know what the terms of your business structure is? Do all the partners in your business partnership understand what their obligations and requirements are in terms of the terms as well, isn't it? So that we've understood where there are risks there. I mean, one of the risks to assess there with business structure is a partnership which hasn't got a written partnership agreement, for example. In that scenario, any partner could call that business in at any point in time. So that's for example, a risk that should be assessed as part of this process. Business continuity, I think that's quite important, isn't it? What things that could impact on the business being able to carry out its functions, isn't it? What things would interfere with that, and to highlight those. So, and some of those are things which they're the risks that we all think about when we talk about assessing risks: fire, flood, etc., isn't it? And the things that you would insure against, of course, as well, isn't it? But I think it's really important to consider some of those risks as well. Health and safety, of course, and security, not just in terms of safety, but also in terms of your financial security as well, and considering what your plan B might be in relation to each of these things as well. Being clear in terms of what your business assets are and how they're used and how they're accessed by the business, and that's important in terms of assessing risk as well, in terms of value of those perhaps on Brexit, how they might be considered, what you can do with those in the process that we're going through at the moment, isn't it? And what could you be looking to do in order to maximise the use that you make of those assets? And then, of course, the final one there is business succession, isn't it? I think that's one of the greatest risks for any business, isn't it? Is not having a clear plan of succession in place, and not having those discussions early on in terms of understanding how that works. So when you're looking at your risk model there, isn't it? You might talk about business succession in terms of what documents you've got in place in relation to that. You might talk about whether there have been discussions in terms of that plan, etc., in terms of what the position is going to be going forward. And exit might actually be a trigger for some of those succession discussions in certain situations as well. What I've done as well is I've broken down a bit further perhaps some of the financial implications to think about in terms of assessing the risks associated with the EU exit in terms of your businesses as well. So you could do this obviously with each of those 5 areas that I've identified in terms of your business, but just to perhaps look a bit more closely at financial implications in particular, because it's one of the ones that I think is causing people the most concern at the moment. So looking at what opportunities there are in terms of funding at the moment for a new business venture or a farming venture that you have or you'd like to develop as part of your farming enterprise, any diversification options that you may want to explore or expand if you've already ventured into different diversification enterprises. So it's looking at what funding is available in relation to those. Financial implications as well in terms of land prices. Certainly over the last couple of months there's been a lot of discussion in relation to land prices, not necessarily in terms of the impact of the EU exit, but in the context of coronavirus, isn't it? And the talks that I've been to and the things that I've listened to in relation to that don't seem to be showing a huge concern in relation to reduction in land prices going forward, which obviously is positive in terms of providing certainty. However, that may change if provisions in relation to the availability of things like agricultural property relief in terms of inheritance tax may have an impact on that. So it's something to keep an eye on. Rental values as well in terms of rent reviews. So for example, at the moment as part of a rent review on an Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy or on a farm business tenancy, we take into consideration the income from the basic payment scheme. But of course, going forward, we're not going to have the basic payment scheme. We will have a sustainable farming scheme instead. What impact may that have in relation to your rent review? And does that have a positive or negative effect in relation to your business viability and affordability in relation to that rent? The basic payment scheme obviously is going to be phased out, and as I said earlier, it's important to calculate what the impact of that is on your business in monetary terms. Similarly with Glasssteer, so the Sustainable Farming Scheme is going to replace not just the basic payment scheme, but it'll replace Glasssteer as well. So it'll be one scheme to cover what the 2 schemes previously have have done. So it's going to be important to bear that in mind as well in terms of the transition to that new sustainable farming scheme. And what we don't know, and I can't tell you, is what that sustainable farming payment is going to be, and how much is going to be, which is, I think, the question we would all like answered at the moment, isn't it? So that we could actually carry out more detailed, budget in terms of what the impact of that would be on our farming businesses, and also, the people who receive that sustainable farming payment, and making sure that you continue to be eligible for that sustainable farming payment going forward. Maximising other capital grant income. So there are other capital grants available at the moment, and that is something else that we need to try and make sure we utilise where possible, isn't it? And I put there not just agricultural ones, because there are capital grants available for new business ideas or diversification, not necessarily strictly directly in terms of agriculture as well, which you may be able to kind of develop as part of your businesses, and also be mindful of tax implications as well, isn't it? So with anything to do with finance, you always have to consider what the tax implications of doing it are as well. So it just gives you an example of how to kind of go into one of those business areas in more detail and look at some of the risks that you may need to be assessing as part of your farming business going forward. And then, in terms of opportunities, there may be lots of other opportunities or business opportunities that you've thought about exploiting or haven't exploited yet, isn't it? Because the circumstances haven't been right. But there may be an opportunity now to obtain funding in relation to that, or there may be an opportunity to look at something different in terms of the development of your business, isn't it? And there may be other uses that can be made of your land or your property or your assets that would enable you to create other income streams into your business as well. There may be opportunities here as well to change your business structure in order to facilitate succession, make it easier for that succession to take place, but also to strengthen your business in the current climate as well, isn't it? Because certainly that clarity and certainty in terms of the operation of your business is going to be important, to have the platform to be able to take advantage of any opportunities that there may be available. And then the last one there is joint ventures and collaboration. We've certainly seen a surge in joint ventures over the last 3 years as a business, isn't it? We're doing more and more joint ventures and collaborative enterprises, for clients, isn't it? And by joint ventures, I don't just mean share farming. I mean the whole suite of options that may be available in terms of working with neighbouring farms, working with other people within the agricultural sector that enable you to add value and to collaborate to create a product which gives you more value and ability to essentially make more money out of what you're producing. So I think there's so many options and opportunities in relation to that as well. So I think that's the end of my kind of formal presentation. So I don't know if anybody's got any questions you'd like to ask me, or whether if there's anything you want to raise out of what I've gone through. Be welcome to ask any if you have.
Yeah, diolch yn fawr, Nerys. Thank you very much, Nerys. We've had a few questions in. So we've had one asking, have full negotiations been underway with other non-EU nations during this period, or are these not allowed until post 1st of January 2021?
Okay, so the one that everybody has heard about is the US, isn't it? And the kind of meetings that have been taking place in relation to a US trade deal. They're allowed to have meetings, and they've been allowed to have meetings in relation to that since the beginning of the year. They weren't allowed to have that until they agreed that exit at the beginning of the year. But they are allowed to have those meetings, isn't it? But they whether they actually get any of those into a position where they are formally agreed before we agree in relation to the EU, I don't know, isn't it? But I think from a farming point of view, it would be beneficial to have the EU agreement agreed first, isn't it? But that may not be possible. I don't know.
Okay, and then the second question, is there any incentive for older generations to retire to hand over to the younger generation?
So if by incentive we mean a kind of financial incentive from government to do that, then the answer is no, unfortunately. And I haven't seen anything in any draft legislation to indicate that will be forthcoming. And it's interesting because, we've had the ability to have such a financial incentive under European legislation for approximately 20 years. Ireland famously utilised it and implemented it in Ireland some time ago, but there was lots of issues in terms of the implementation of it there. I don't think we will see that kind of direct financial incentive. Having said that, I think in the legislation there is a lot of emphasis about encouragement, though, of succession and support for that succession, and also emphasis on trying to essentially reduce the demographic in terms of the age of farmers as well, isn't there? So there is definitely that wording and reference within the legislation. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is support in terms of the advice side of it in relation to that. I should probably add as well, there is at the moment obviously the Venture programme, which is available through Farming Connect, which helps you through that process, isn't it? So it enables you to have advice from a farm business consultant. It also enables you to have legal advice on that process and on the implications of that, and that's in addition to the succession surgeries that are available to Farming Connect and the other advice surgeries that are available. So I think, if it's something you're thinking about and you're not sure where to start or what questions you need to ask, I think it's really valuable to start having those conversations, even if you don't quite know yet what you want to do and you're wanting to try different things out. Because certainly as an advisor and one of those, we would look at lots of different options. We would say, well, this is one option, this is another option, this is another option, and we'd consider the tax implications of all of that as well as part of that process. So it gives you a chance to have a discussion about it and think about it.
Diolch yn fawr. The next question, given the developed powers now with Westminster following the great reapply of the bill, do you have any understanding of how likely it is that these powers will be returned to the WG? Is there a chance that Westminster might retain these powers, which would mean that legislation drafted in Westminster will take place in Welsh legislations?
I think agriculture is devolved. So a legislation in relation to agriculture, it's within the power of Welsh Government to develop that and to implement that. And certainly when the Agriculture Act was first being developed, there was concern about how much of that would be devolved, isn't it, and whether there would be an attempt to try and retain that. I think what has been retained in what we've got at the moment in terms of that draft Agriculture Act is the framework, essentially, and the monetary side, the financial side of it as well. It's the Treasury essentially that decides in relation to the funding side of that, and it's funded via that the Barnett formula. But I think Welsh Government have got, you know, quite a lot of power in terms of the development of the new agricultural legislation in Wales, and I think that is shown in terms of how it's developed. The Agriculture Act is developed as well, and how Welsh Government are now developing the legislation that we're going to have in place in Wales.
Yeah, thank you. And as you said, the Glastir and the single file payment is phasing out, but do you think there'll be a transition period where we're going to swap over to the new scheme, or do you think it's just going to happen overnight and we're just going to have to deal with it? Or do you think it's going to, you know, maybe 1 year we're going to start going into it and then single file payment may stop in 2 years? Or do you think that will be, because due to the coronavirus right now, we don't really know where we stand with any more grants, do we? Like the farm business grants or the Glastir, because usually it starts this time of year with fencing. So it's quite a difficult time for farmers to know what's next, isn't it?
Yeah. I can tell you what my preference would be. My preference would be that we had a clear understanding as to what the policy and the scheme that we're going to have implemented going forward is, and that we then have at least a year, if not a year and a half, 2 years before it's actually implemented. Because it's the time between when you know the rules and regulations that you're going to have to abide by, and the scheme that you are going to be looking to be a part of, perhaps, isn't it? It's the time between knowing exactly where you stand in relation to that and when that's actually implemented that's important. So for me, that isn't actually a transition period necessarily. That is understanding exactly where you stand and having time whereby you can consider the implications of that, look at how that impacts on you, and to be able to reorganise things to make it something that you're able to adapt to in time for when it's actually implemented, so that it's actually implemented in one go. That's a typical professional answer, I suppose, isn't it? But from an implementation point of view, that is the easiest thing, because when they talk about a transition period, my fear about that always is we end up with two systems working at the same time, and that adds complication and, you know, and lack of clarity and uncertainty, isn't it? So I would rather have complete certainty as to what the new scheme is going to look like, and then have at least a year whereby we can work out what implication that has for us, and then put the things in place that we need to put in place in relation to being to working under that new scheme. So that would be my ideal world. If anybody wants to let Welsh Government know that, then we've got line.
How can farmers best prepare for the EU exit, and where should we start with the planning? Because if it's going to happen in December, is there something we can do now to prepare ourselves?
So I think you know, that's what part of the conversation this evening has been about, isn't it? It's about what you can look at in terms of your business, and I've talked about it in very much in generic terms, in terms of, you know, looking at your business and assessing risk within your business, isn't it? But that is essentially what you need to do, isn't it? Because, you know, what might be an impact for one business won't have the same impact for somebody else, isn't it? So you have to really look at your individual business. And I think one of the things perhaps we haven't talked about very much tonight is the implication that trade changes might have on your particular business. So, for example, for me personally, you know, sheep trade is going to be particularly important in terms of our farming business, isn't it? So, you know, thinking about when our lambs are going to be on for slaughter, isn't it? Are we going to want to have lambs left over, you know, over Christmas this year, or are we going to try and make sure that they're all gone before year end, isn't it? And, you know, these kinds of things might have an impact in terms of, you know, how we plan for that and how we feed and how we decide in relation to that. And it might have an impact as well on what we decide to do in terms of our numbers next year, in terms of our tupping regime for next year, in terms of, so I think it's those kinds of things, and they're very practical things for individual farmers to consider themselves as to, you know, what impact a change to the market might have in relation to them. Because, you know, I think you know, there are opportunities in certain sectors, but sheep would be a sector where there is a lot of press about the implications and impact that it will have in terms of the price that you will get for lamb going forward.
Yeah, because Farming Connect can obviously fund for business plans. So then if a business plan is set in place, maybe they can review it then maybe after December. So then they know what's happening from there, isn't it? So it's just about maybe reviewing it, isn't it? Every couple of months or every half a year, so we know where the development is going. There isn't any more questions, so diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much, Nerys. Hopefully we've answered everyone's questions fully. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr, Nerys. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr. Nos da.